Hi there, and welcome to this webinar on engaging consumers, tricky or transformational. Welcome, we're really happy that you're here with us today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we meet, wherever you are, and to absolutely pay my respects to elders past and present. We all at this table and certainly from NADA remain committed to closing the gap in health system deficiencies in relation to Aboriginal health outcomes. We'd also really like to acknowledge our partners in this presentation, and that is APSAD, the Australasian Professional Society on Alcohol and Drugs, and we really appreciate their partnership. So today, as we talk, we've got some wonderful people on our panel. My name is Suzie Hudson. I'm the Clinical Director at NADA. And joining us here today is Chris on my left. He's a consumer representative. We have Fiona, our NADA Consumer Engagement Coordinator. Maureen here from St Vincent's Alcohol and Drug Service, and she's a consumer participation worker there. And Madden over here, she's a PhD candidate at UNSW Centre for Social Research in Health and Drug, and a drug user advocate. I'm sure you're very familiar with some of Annie's work. So welcome to everybody here on the panel. We're hoping really to get lots of good conversation going. Before we get started, I do want to acknowledge the great work that Fiona Poeder's been doing, particularly now out is our consumer participation audit tool. You can find that on the NADA website right now. And this tool is really designed to start to get you, the workers and the organisation thinking about how you might be engaging consumers better, to really participate actively, not only in their treatment, but in the shaping of how the organisation is. So we'd really encourage you to take a look at that, certainly get in touch with us and start to engage with how you can do better in engaging consumers in your work. So today, the focus of the webinar is really around how do we engage consumers, and the fact that it can absolutely be tricky, but also absolutely also an opportunity for transformation in terms of the work that we do. So what we'll be doing today on the webinar is we'll be speaking to each of our panellists today and getting their perspectives. We'd really encourage you to get involved, to ask questions of them as they're speaking to you. You may have heard at the beginning there was a bit of an intro there that helped you understand what it was you needed to do in order to ask a question. But just to remind you, apparently in the top right corner of your screens there's a dark blue hand icon. So all you need to do is select that and get the questions coming in, because we'd love to hear from you. I'd like to start and kick us off really in introducing Chris. He's our consumer representative, and he's going to talk us through some of those tricky aspects about what it is to be a consumer rep and some of his personal experiences in the field. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you, thank you.
So can you tell us a little bit about your experience in terms of being a consumer representative?
Yeah, sure. From my experience, drug use and drug addiction and all the, however you want to describe it, is a very stigmatised condition. It's very stigmatised, it's criminalised, and therefore my interaction with services has been one with there's no trust. I believe there's no trust from their point of view. They don't, like you walk into a service or you walk into a doctor's surgery and straight away the body language of the doctor will change, and you know, he may seem, you know, like close his drawer or, you know, and it's them little subtle things that like put your guard up straight away as soon as you walk in there. And I think it's we were speaking about it earlier today. It's a lot of them little experiences that have happened over a very long time, of them subtle discriminative body languages that has an impact.
So some of those small things that people can be doing
absolutely.
In responding, it starts to build over time, you're saying.
Absolutely.
And what impact does that have on people like yourself?
You internalise it, and you do. I did internalise it, and it really makes you, you struggle, and it does. It makes you feel like you're a scumbag. Right. And you're walking in to ask for help, and you've been told, you've been directed to stand in a certain spot, and you're watched, and you know, in some services they may do it, They may do it politely, but nevertheless,
Right.
they are still discriminating against you. And a lot of things, I think, that my experience in rehabs, it's the same thing. The way it's set up is one of not trust. I mean, you get urine.
Yeah.
Because why don't you just ask if you've used the drug? But no, they have to urine you to see if they detect something.
Right.
That in itself is there's no trust there.
So there's a lot of power.
Absolutely,
there.
and I think it's in a lot of cases I've experienced, it's their way or the highway. It's I feel you got people that are, given directing services that they don't really know anything about. Well, they don't know anything about the underlying issues, yet they're the expert on the issue. And I think, we've got a long way to go.
And so what sort of impact does that have if you're reaching out for help or you're going along to, say, a residential rehabilitation service and you're asking for some of that help and then they're treating you in a way that has you sort of silenced? What sort of impact does it have on your experience of that treatment?
It has a negative impact. Like I said, you've internalised it, and I don't think you can begin to be honest with it and have an honest conversation if that's there, if that barrier's there. I mean, how do you address the issue if you can't really bring it out into light? Or if you do, you're going to be judged. Like, rehab, for example, I was in a rehab and one of the guys in my group's father passed away. He used and he consequently ended up getting kicked out for using. And I think, well, how is that helping the guy? That's, to me, is that's crazy.
Yeah.
And it's where it all comes from. It's our DNA sector and service sector is come from a place that's fundamentally wrong.
Yes, in terms of that judgment.
Because it's heavily stigmatised and it's criminalised. Therefore, you're bad and, we've got to fix it. But so it's...
And for other groups that you may have come into contact with, either in the prison system or in treatment services, so other marginalised groups like Aboriginal people, or what sorts of other experiences have you witnessed in terms of their experience of stigma and what you're describing?
I think they've got an added stigma, especially Indigenous people. Indigenous people are way overrepresented in the criminal justice system, but they definitely, I've seen that they've got they get treated different. I mean, personally, I feel I was treated bad and they get treated worse. So, and I think, And
so what are some of the things, like having had those experiences and starting to think about your role now in terms of what sorts of advice and thoughts would you have for people who are providing services in terms of engaging better with consumers?
I think it's education. I think it's education, and they've got to start to listen to consumers. I really do. I think let's face it, look at the outcomes aren't very good in all across the board. The numbers that make it through, say, rehabs and especially the criminal justice system is appalling. So at what stage? I mean, I was in a program and I had the director say to me, I can lead a horse to water, but I can't make it drink, right? And I said to her, well, if the majority of horses that you're leading to the water aren't drinking, at what stage do you turn around and go, well, hang on, maybe something we're doing that's not right?
What a fantastic message.
So that's my...
I think that's a fantastic... What you're saying there really makes so much sense, which is at what point do you, as the service, start to review and think about your own practices? Instead
of pointing the finger and going, oh, you're not trying hard enough. So I think it's definitely education. I think it's, having someone there in the service that from marginalised communities that can, be as a middle person between the consumer and the service, perhaps.
So you feel like having consumer representatives to sort of support the person that's in the service would actually help them to voice some of those concerns.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And in terms of, when you're saying it would help to have some consumer representatives, what would be your thoughts about how an organisation might start that process, or how might they start hearing their consumers and their clients more? What sorts of things might work? Are there any experiences you've had that were positive, that were useful to you?
I have. I've had positive experiences, and I think that it was because a lot of the language used was I went to a doctor recently that just got it.
Okay.
Basically got the underlying issues that I was dealing with. I was getting out of prison. So he was asking the right questions also.
Okay.
And he's more like holistic and saying, okay, we'll get this sorted, that sorted. And the body language, he wasn't, judgmental. And, he was, that's all I can say, he just got it, actually.
So it was so it wasn't just the things he was saying or the questions he was asking, it was the whole way he was with you.
He wasn't phased, he was going, yeah, cool, it's great. He wasn't saying, okay, don't use drugs or lecturing me on how, to get, how not to use drugs. He was saying where you're at, he was meeting me where I was at. Okay, let's sort out, what do you need help with? How can I help you?
So this is
what I can do for you, sort of thing. Yeah.
Treating you like a human being.
Yeah,
just literally
absolutely,
having a chat with you, not going straight into that conversation about whether you're going to use or not. It's not, just really starting to talk with you where you're at.
It can be really important, I think, just listening to what you're saying around, you said he got it, and that thing of it can be really tiring to have to tell the story from scratch every time. And when you find someone who gets it, as you say, gets where you're at and maybe where you've been a bit as well, and those underlying things, as you say, just makes it that much easier, doesn't it, to get on with where you want to go.
You relax and you open up and you can start to work through stuff.
Yeah.
And I mean, I had a doctor, before I'd seen this particular doctor I'm speaking about, I had a doctor who I went through the whole story and about getting out of prison and drug use and whatnot. And, after I'd spoken to her, she turned around and said, oh, well, it'd be silly for you to go and use again. And I just thought...
You haven't heard anything
I've said,
Yeah. Understand. We've got a question that's come through for you, Chris. I'm just going to ask that to you now. The question is around how would we, the organisation, recruit or find good doctors so we can make recommendations or referrals for consumers? So I think what they're asking is really how do they be confident that, say, a doctor or another worker is going to be the right fit and do, as you say, and really make that consumer feel supported?
I'm not sure if I'd be able to ask that question. Maybe you, Fiona, would be better off.
Yeah, maybe. It'd be great if we could have a register, but it's probably not a thing we're allowed to do. A lot of the referrals or recommendations happen between people. And
so it's word of mouth?
It's word of mouth, yeah.
Right.
And the big problem, I think, is that we often hear the horror stories and the bad stories, and we less hear about the good stories.
Right.
As saying.
Yeah. So it's really, so I think what you're saying, and as we move on to Fiona, so I think what you're saying there, really, Chris, is in summary, is it's a lot about people's attitude. It's how they're engaging with you. It's being human and empathetic with you.
Absolutely.
And really looking at you as a whole person beyond just the substance use or...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, in relation to the question that came in, I think just also in your interview processes or your recruitment processes, really putting thought into the questions that you might ask and of any candidate or person who you might be looking to employ. Really, look at the sorts of things that Chris is sort of talking about around sort of how much someone gets stuff, their experience, their attitudes, their language. Drill into that a bit more so that, you're really sort of seeing the character of the person, what they really think about these issues a bit more rather than just a kind of real cursory process.
And what your qualifications are.
And just on the back of that, I think it'd be great if we had consumer reps on interview panels.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. That's a great response in terms of finding the right people, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
So we might, if it's okay with you, is to move on now to Fiona. Fiona's going to talk to us a little bit about language, stigma, and certainly around access and some of the barriers that might be there. So I'll hand over now to Fiona.
Yeah, could you flip
I
on?
certainly can.
Thanks. Okay. When we talk about stigma, it's complex. There's a lot of interrelated factors. At the bottom line, it's about our judgments, our thoughts, what we think people should or shouldn't be do, what they can and can't do, or what they believe that drug users can and can't do in this instance. It's often inherent and people don't actually recognise or realise that they're stigmatising. It's not something that's written there. But at the same token, it's, I don't want to make this about an us and them. There are ways forward around this. All too often, the basis of stigma is morality, and if we could pull morality away from issues around drug use and people who use drugs or have a history of drug use, and make it about human rights and respect, it would make a world a better place. But just to put this into an example of how stigma impacts on access and the part that language plays in that, we have a lot of labels assigned to people who use drugs or have a history of drugs and alcohol. And some of the common ones are around, junkie, pothead, any more?
Addict.
Sorry?
Addict.
Druggos.
Druggos, alco. Well, But what's also attached to that are the characteristics that are associated with those labels. So when people, and this is not everyone, talk about junkies or the like, it's about those characteristics that they assume that go with that. So that's around things like they can't work, they don't parent, they're self-centred, they only think about themselves, they're a danger, they're aggressive, those sorts of things. One of the examples that I'd like to go into is an old friend of mine, and this was a few years ago, but I think it's still relevant today. This woman and her partner were on the methadone program, had a child, and the child was quite young, at the time about 18 months old, and he fell sick. And first they went to their GP, and the GP said, there's nothing wrong, go home. And this GP was also the prescriber. You're making too much of this, your attention seeking, it's about you, it's not about the child, there's nothing wrong. They went back a second time. Then, again, there's nothing wrong, give him some Panadol, Then they went to the hospital, and because they thought that it was important that they disclose their being on a methadone program, the emergency department, as soon as they disclosed that, it was about them and their drug use and not about the health of the child, And real or perceived, this is how this couple took that. They come back so they're sent home again, this is about you, it's not about the child, there's nothing wrong, you're attention seeking, you're overreacting, you're probably not a good parent anyway, They go back later, and this is the next day, and by this time the young boy's been diagnosed with meningitis.
Wow.
So in terms of that, and unfortunately I've got lots of examples of this sort of behaviour or what happens. So in a general sense, the community expectations, or in this case the hospital, was all about this couple's drug use, what they should or shouldn't be doing, the morality attached to that rather than the health of the child. And their judgment of that couple as parents who happen to be on a program, a methadone program. So all too often, like I said, it's about drugs, drug use, and not about the person, as we were talking about. What that leads to is reduced outcomes. In that instance, he went on to have long-term disabilities, and he's an adult now, that young child. But that's a lifetime of extra care, extra cost to, the hospital and medical community, what they've had to go through, and those parents' guilt that they've had to go through, and the impact that has. What often happens when these sorts of things happen is people won't access services because they've had that experience, or they heard of other people having those experiences, and we talk, we talk about the bad.
It keeps them away, doesn't it?
It keeps them away. They expect to be stigmatised, discriminated against, or we'll choose a service until this part of our story. Another service will get this part of our story, and we'll never get a holistic care. So, and that's how it works in terms of, reduced outcomes for people. Where we go from there is we bring it on, we take it on, and we deserve this treatment. So we talk about that couple, they ended up splitting. Whether that would have happened or not, we don't know. There's a lifetime of guilt, this is my fault, I did this, to my child. I deserve to be treated badly. I'm a horrible person. I'm bad.
If I wasn't a drug user, this wouldn't have happened.
All those things. And we get that cycle goes on and on. So when we talk about language in that, so we use words. Can I have that?
You surely can. There you go.
So, NADA and NEWA, the New South Wales Users and Aids Association, developed these language matters resources. And we did that co-produced with consumers right the way through, thorough consultation. And what I think we found, and these resources are also available on NADA's and NEWA's websites, what we found for people, consumers, people with experience, drug users, whatever, it's less about the words people use to them than about how they're treated. A lot of it is treat me with respect. Treat me as a person. Some people jack up when you get called a junkie, understandably, and some people don't, But it's also about asking people what they want to be called. Certainly don't want to be called a junkie, and all the connotations that come with that. Because I'm myself so much more, I think.
Absolutely.
Than my drugs or drug use.
And Fiona, how do you engage clinical people or people running treatment programs or AOD workers? How do you engage people to help them to see that this is useful in their work? What's your sort of suggestions around that?
It can be tricky. And when we've done work on this, people have said, oh, this is so PC, or, or I use this language. And I've used this language for forever in this sector. And so sometimes it's a matter of chipping away. Sometimes it's about challenging language, and when we hear others using that language, it could be subtle challenge, it could be forthright challenge. It depends on where you're at that time. I would never want to put people in danger or risk or of any type. It's about education, which I'll ask Annie to speak about in a little bit. But it is about chipping away and directing people to these sorts of resources and getting an understanding of what is behind words and language.
Excellent. That's great. Thank you. And Fiona, we'll absolutely be coming back to you. We'll absolutely have some time for some questions towards the end too. So let's keep that in our minds as we go along. I'd like to now introduce Maureen. Maureen's going to really start to talk a little bit about the transformational part, and that is once you start to really think this is, we want to do some change, we need to think about how we engage consumers in our organisation, what are some of the real benefits that can come, and what are maybe some of the things that you've learnt in this space?
Sure. I was actually going to begin by stealing Chris's question, what's tricky about it? Because while it can be transformational, of course, consumer participation can be really tricky too. And one thing that, like I said, Chris already touched on, is the fact that I don't feel like I can be representative of all the drug users out there. How can I? I haven't been to jail, touch wood, so I can't represent the needs of people who have been to jail. We're all different. We've all had different experiences. So when we're talking about consumer representation, we need to remember that one person can't really represent the whole experience of people who inject drugs, and we really need probably a range of people in any given moment. I suppose, though, to move on to what is transformational about doing consumer participation, I think, and this also kind of answers one of the questions we had about how do we involve our people who've been really hurt by the system, I suppose is how I see them. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters, and our Maori brothers and sisters, and all our homeless people who have really sort of been, really treated badly by this system. I have seen consumer groups operate where they might not, when you look at it on the surface, you think they haven't achieved a lot in terms of changing things about the service. But the people who attend the consumer group change in themselves. And the difference is that they find out that they have rights, they find out that, they deserve respect, that there is, even in the Department of Health, we have this system of standards now where, standard number 2 is you will involve consumers in your services.
Okay.
I tell that to people and they go, oh, wow, what? That's great. But the thing is, we're not really doing it very well in practice yet. But I think I see people just some knowledge that using drugs is a health issue, not even a health issue, it's a human rights issue. When people who have been really oppressed come to understand that, their attitude shifts a bit. And you see just a little more, I want to be careful of the words I use here, but, self-esteem kind of lifts. People walk just feeling a bit more proud of themselves because they know they have rights. When I see people on the street interacting with the police around King's Cross, it's not, the people in the consumer group, they seem a lot more sure of themselves when they're interacting with authority now. I know this is all a bit anecdotal, but that's a sort of change that I see happening, that even though the services might not have seen a lot of change, the people have changed about how they feel about themselves. And that's huge, invaluable.
That's huge.
So that's,
that thing too that we can often get very focused once again on the organisation. We know what's in it for the organisation, how will we do better, which is absolutely important. But what you're really talking about is for those consumers, they're feeling much more engaged in society, with other people. So that can only be a benefit to them in terms of their treatment and their lives, the quality of their life. Yeah,
and feeling like they are part of the community, that they are relevant and have a right to be listened to and heard. All those things. You just can't put
No,
you know,
that's a
value on
really
it.
good point. I think we often miss that point.
Yeah. So that's what I find has been really transformational about some of my work. I think the other thing I've seen is when you can actually shift staff members' perception about stuff. You know, that is probably one of the, you know, again, brilliant things I've experienced. And it happens really slowly. You know, it can happen over time. And like we said earlier, there's no point sort of beating anyone around the head saying you have a bad attitude. It's more like just saying, I don't quite see it that way, and slowly people will listen to what you say and they might, you know, start changing their minds, and it might take years, but I have seen cultures change in organisations for the better, because just maybe one or two staff members start saying, no, I don't actually see it that way, I see it a bit differently, this is how I see it. And then next thing you know, a few years later, everybody's sort of saying that, and it's like, oh wow, cool. So, you know, it can happen, but yeah, you just need to allow people room, I think, to change their mind, you know, to do it in their own terms. Often when people have sort of put all their weight behind a belief or a position, it can be really hard to then go, oh no, well actually I've shifted on that. So yeah, it is difficult, but it can be done. Yeah.
And so in your experience sort of moving into that space, Maureen, what was it like? Do you feel like, you know, it's important to have supports with you if you're working as a consumer rep, that you've got supports within the organisation? Are there things that, that should be done to really help that process along?
Yeah, definitely. I've certainly got I've got a list of tips here,
Fantastic.
including
That would be great. That would be really good.
I think for support, we need more than one consumer. Yeah, it's very hard for one person. For a start, you know, like I said, I don't represent everyone's views, but it can be very isolating. It can be a very stressful place to be in. So by even having more than one consumer rep in an organisation, I think that can really help. I think start with something small and achievable, and just do it. Even if you think it's tokenistic, you have to start somewhere. Start with something easy. Give clients a sense of having achieved something.
Get some runs on the board.
Yeah, get some runs on the board, exactly. So even if it starts out asking people, what colour do you want the walls painted? At least it's a starting point, and you can move on from there to more, you know, the issues that really do concern us from there. Little things like just putting in that feedback box, the suggestions box into your service, and then maybe establishing a group with service users who go through that feedback box and look at the suggestions in there. You know, I think that's a really good way too. If you do that in conjunction with staff, that'll help build relationships with staff as well.
So what you're saying there, Maureen, I think to pick up on that is it's really important when you're having suggestion boxes that you make sure that you look at
Please.
Yeah. Because I think sometimes those boxes can sit there for quite a while.
I think
just doing
involving consumers in looking at the box is fantastic.
Exactly.
That's a great suggestion.
I mean, a great start, isn't it? And something that's not that difficult to do.
It's pretty easy, and that's what I'm sort of thinking about here. Easy things that you could start today. The other thing, though, one consumer said to me is there's one service I know, every time a suggestion goes into the box, the staff go, ooh, and get it out. And they go, hey, no, it was me that wrote it. So just things like that.
Wait.
Think about that.
Wait till they leave.
Right. So I think there's a lot that you can do to start consumer participation activities in your service. It doesn't have to be difficult. And then you also have to act on stuff. I think that's probably the biggest issue I have is we collect all this feedback. Acting on it, of course it's hard, but if we don't act, then I think consumers will lose interest. They don't, you know, if you don't get anywhere, if you don't achieve anything, then of course you're going to lose interest and drop out. So,
We're also used to not having our suggestions acted upon or not getting feedback, and so why bother?
Why bother?
Exactly.
And that's been my experience. You know, trying to establish consumer groups, people often think, what's the point?
Yeah. And so it's really important that you have that follow through, that there's actually things done.
Yeah.
And when it's done well, Maureen, when you sort of set some of these things up, these processes up, consumers feel like they're a bit more engaged. What happens to the service? So in terms of the service delivery, do you feel like things start to shift a bit from being very worker focused, like this is the job we have to do, more to the clients? Do you find that that's been your experience? It becomes a bit more sensitive to what
I think, certainly when staff see consumer groups working well, that they shift their kind of frame of looking at it too. And then, I know of one service I worked at where the consumers are sort of getting involved with, the daily operations of the service. And the staff are like, oh, this is great. Whereas maybe 5 years ago, they might not have thought that was so great. It can be done. It's just small steps, and it can take a while. Don't get disheartened. But, definitely I know of at least one service where peers come in regularly and do education.
Wow, that's really... And do you think that has an impact on how new people coming to the service, like new consumers, knowing that might be there or seeing it, or sort of being able to see it like a visual cue that this happens in this service? Do you think that it helps to engage them to come along and... I think this is vouchers for that service.
Yeah, definitely. It's a good sort of advertisement for that service, that obviously these people care about what we think and what our views are and how the service should operate.
Because I can imagine, having worked a lot in the space, it becomes a lot more front of mind if you've got consumers that are on the staff, that are there, that are present, that are doing, as you say, running workshops or running education. It becomes, as a worker, a lot more present, that how important and the contribution that can be made to
you see it working. And I think as a worker, especially if you are a little bit not unsure of these ideas, and to see it actually work in reality, it's the best thing you can really do. It did remind me of another question I got asked, though.
Please.
Probably running out of time. But that's all about being an injecting drug user, working in drug and alcohol, but you're not working in a peer role.
Yeah, please tell us a little bit about that, because that's some of the tricky stuff too.
So I've had a bit of experience. I've worked both as a peer for user organisations, and I've worked as a drug and alcohol worker in a non-peer role. And it is a pretty frustrating thing to be, and I think a lot of you out there might be able to relate this, because I think a lot of people who are attracted to the drug and alcohol field do have lived experience. There's no doubt about it, but we're not allowed to talk about that. We're not allowed to be honest about our lived experience, and that can be such a disempowering place to be for so many reasons. And I suppose my big question is why is that the case? Why is it unprofessional to talk about your lived experience, especially if your lived experience can be helpful to the person you're working with? And sometimes what I mean by helpful is just that, maybe your lived experience is you took Eckie while you're at uni for a couple of years. But even to someone who injects heroin, it'll be like, oh, well, you have done something illegal. Maybe you get it on some level. And there's just this feeling of being less isolated. You've supposedly made dumb choices too. It just can help people connect. And I think if you think it could help somebody for you to divulge your lived experience, why shouldn't you? Of course, the policy says you can't, so you probably shouldn't.
But I think what you've raised there, Maureen, and something that is really we should be talking more about talking more about that and why we do those things. What is it about? What are those policies there for? What's that about? How do we do it in safe ways? So let's keep thinking about that because I think that's a really good point, and I think it's something that we often just don't go there. We just don't talk about it, and we need to be talking about it more in the context of our organisations. But there'll be more time for questions for you, Maureen. But what I'd like to do now is I'd like to hand over now to Annie Madden, who has an awesome Order of Australia because of her great contribution to the field more broadly, but absolutely to the movement of alcohol and drug, people who use alcohol and other drugs. And I'd like to introduce her to really talk about research and how important it is for us to start to consider engaging our consumers in the research as researchers. We know that for a lot of people who use alcohol and other drugs, they are the subject of research. Things are done to them. And I think, it'd be great to hear from you, Annie, about how do we get better at engaging people in the process.
No worries, thank you. Okay, so I've got a PowerPoint. I think people are able to access that if they want to follow along. So I'll get straight into it. I've got a little bit to cover, but I guess I wanted to start by just a little bit of some of my kind of background on this whole issue of peer involvement in research, because obviously now I'm doing a PhD and I'm engaged in a role as a community liaison and engagement person with the Centre for Social Research in Health at UNSW, which is fantastic. But my interest in this issue goes back quite a long way, really, and kind of started when I was first working at NUA as the executive officer of NUA back in the 90s, and I saw even then that there was, increasing kind of calls on us to be involved in research, to participate in research, advisory committees, and to advise and research in various ways. And it was a really growing thing, and at that time, I guess it's important to say, it was a really sort of dynamic time. HIV was a big issue for people who inject drugs as well in Sydney at that time, but also hepatitis C had just been sort of identified as a distinct form of viral hepatitis. So there was a lot going on as well as the drug and alcohol issues, and so we started looking at developing a research working group at NUA back then, and got some researchers, notably Margaret McDonald, who sadly, so both Fiona and Maureen have been involved in this work that I'm talking about with me. They were both at NUA at the time, and she sadly passed away some years ago, but started the Australian NSP survey all those years ago. And she was involved in the research working group we set up in '96. And it was we wanted to sort of look at this issue of ethics and peer involvement or consumer involvement in research, and we started looking at what we could do, what we could develop, and there was a lot of pushback from researchers, as you can imagine back then, I guess. But some of it was because there was real fear that we were kind of aiming to develop some sort of compliance-based tool for researchers, that you must do this or must do that, you must consult with us, or, God forbid that consumers might even endorse or sign off on research proposals or something. So we had to take it carefully. And before we did set up the group, and before we got to do too much work on it, I actually moved to the national level to AVIL and negotiated with NUA to take that work to the national level, because we actually thought that's probably where it could really have a home. And we ended up developing this document, which will be familiar to some people. It's published in 2003, but it is the National Statement on Ethical Issues for Research Involving People Who Use Drugs, illicit drugs and injecting drugs. And it's a really, if you haven't seen it, have a look at it. It's a real, particularly if you're involved in research, but, even as service providers, etc. Really great document. To this day, all of it stands. It's quite practical and does give some really good advice around doing research. But I guess to finish on that sort of that work, it really we got inspiration from a lot of work that's been done in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander space around ethics and community engagement in research. And of course, there are important differences in the work that AVIL did on that issue. But I guess what was most important about it, it wasn't a set of compliance-based guidelines, but rather a sort of tool to help build trust and engagement, meaningful engagement. And to this day, as far as I know, that document stands as sort of the only kind of international document of its kind. And it's really been used a great deal by researchers. It's increasingly cited, and in fact, the NH and MRC have also cited it in a review they did on human research ethics and recommended its use. So, the conversation is well and truly underway in this space now. And I guess in my roles now, what I do see is a lot more interest in this issue. There are now a lot more peers or consumers as co-authors on papers and academic papers as recently I'm currently involved in a guest editorship with Carla Treloar and Joanne Neal from King's College in London, looking at doing a thematic issue, if you like, of the Harm Reduction Journal on peer involvement in research.
Fantastic.
So it's really sort of, quite elevated as an issue now, and there are consumer groups and user groups sort of involved in research institutes as well. So that's kind of where, some of the background and where my interest in this sort of stems from. But I guess I just wanted to spend the rest of the time being a bit more practical about some of the issues involved in peer involvement in research. And this issue of tricky or transformational, I thought, it applies very well in this space too. And like the others have said, really the answer is that it's both, that anything that you do that's kind of worth doing really can be both complex and even difficult. But it doesn't mean to say it's not worth doing. And in fact, what I've encountered around peer involvement in research over the years is, too often, I guess, researchers may be seeing this as some sort of kind of additional obligation. It's almost like they're doing a favour to consumers to involve them, or we're still seeing it as a bit of a burden, some other box to tick, in their research process. But the truth of the matter is in terms of transformational, peer involvement in research really does improve the quality of the research. It improves, the research process itself and the outcomes from that research. And that's been shown over and over again. So it's neither an obligation or an additional box to tick. It is something that can make your research just better. So really worth doing. Some of the key issues around sort of how we might move from that involving peers in research from being tricky to being transformational. How do we move along that pathway? I think we need to be really honest as researchers going into this, that there's a whole lot of prevailing attitudes that we've talked about already today, and the background around the criminalisation and stigma that is so entrenched around this issue and the impact of prohibition. That's the context of doing research with peers, and you have to acknowledge that. Like, if you don't acknowledge that, your research is not going to be improved through this process. And also, I guess, we need to understand that backdrop even decides what gets researched and what doesn't get researched, what topics we look at, what we don't. So that needs to be acknowledged. I think also researchers also need to acknowledge that they bring their own values to their research as well, and not try and pretend that, everyone's research is, entirely objective and scientific. Research, people bring their values, often very deeply held, long-held views and attitudes, and I think it is better to acknowledge those than try and pretend that they don't exist, because it comes out in your research. Working with peers, I think also, it's good to kind of, as part of building trusting relationships with people, I think we need to acknowledge with the peers involved that you acknowledge the environment that you're working in, and the two things I've already said. And I think towards that is taking a strength-based approach to things. So in moving from that sort of tricky environment of criminalisation and stigma and discrimination and people feeling disempowered in a process, to one where people feel that their agency is acknowledged, their skills are acknowledged, their expertise is acknowledged, not always looking at people's deficits and their problems and their lack of capacity to do things. In a research space, I think if you want to involve researchers, peers in your research, you really need to acknowledge people's agency and their strengths and their assets and take a strength-based approach. Some other things I think researchers really need to be thinking about is look at your core policies and frameworks in your research institute or the environment in which you work. Making sure that, you start there, using the ABLE document as a guide, and making sure that if you are going to involve peers in your research, that you've got some good structures and processes in place upon which to build that engagement. Involving people in all stages of the research. Don't come to drug user organisations when you've already got something funded and completely designed and wonder why people get upset about it. And then you're told, which we have often been at ABLE and you and other places I've worked, that we can't really, fund your involvement in this research because it's already all been worked out and we don't really have any budget. Really, if you want to have meaningful engagement with people, involve people in every stage of the planning. Training and support is really important if you want to engage peers in research as well. People will need skills, practical skills in writing, in research, in reading literature, in understanding that whole process of academic publishing and how everything works. It is possible for people to understand and be part of these processes, but they do need to understand how ethics committees work and how, all of the rules that go with doing rigorous ethical research. People can get their heads around that, but they need proper support and training to do so.
But they are capable. I think that's the point
Absolutely,
too, Annie. I think sometimes we can be very, overprotective of consumers and peers and say, well, I don't think that they'll be able to understand that. I think that that's just a total myth that we need to bust.
And we have lots of evidence of that not being the case, but you do actually have to put effort into that.
Provide
don't
that
just
training
sort of,
and support.
Don't provide the training and support and then sort of cut people out of the process because you're worried that it'll be over their heads or whatever. Make sure you sort of invest in that process.
Just on that, Annie, remember when Margaret McDonald came in to Newer and she provided us all with some pretty basic research skills training and, we just went out and started researching stuff.
Exactly.
It seemed really easy to me back then and now later down the track it seems so hard.
Well, it can be made really hard. I think it sort of goes to this last point in this slide, which is around different peers for different roles and different stages of your research. Some people will love getting out and helping you recruit people. Others will love being a peer interviewer. Others will really be into the writing up process and the analysis process. Some people are into the whole ride and the whole trip. But, really just rather than assuming people can't do things, look at where they're really interested and what they'd like to be involved in. And as you say, just have a can-do attitude about it. Buddy systems and empowerment is a really great way, getting people to work together, to share skills and experience rather than having the single peer consumer, as we've talked about. Be clear on expectations, roles, and responsibilities up front. Don't wait for conflicts to arise and problems to arise. Time is important. Don't try and sort of squeeze things in. Make sure you give peers, and particularly people from peer-based organisations, if you want them involved in your research, plenty of time for that process. Build the time in because it takes time. Research takes time and you can't sort of expect someone to turn around comments on a really complex draft paper really quickly. These are some of the things that, people have other commitments. So make sure that if you really want meaningful engagement, you allow time for that. And take an emergent approach to peer involvement, which is, an ongoing process of checking in with people about how's it going, what can we do better, how can we improve this engagement process in every project that we do, rather than sort of seeing an individual project as the be-all and end-all, because it really is about genuine participation. I couldn't talk about peer involvement in research without saying pay people. I should just stop there, I think. I mean, it's so obvious. Pay people. People don't come for free. Their labour doesn't come for free. Their expertise doesn't come for free. Pay people. Pay them properly. It's not your business what people spend their money on, like anyone. And I guess that means no vouchers in research as well. I know I'll get pushback on that, but in my opinion, they're patronising. Acknowledge people properly and ensure that you protect confidentiality properly. This is really important in this space. You'll have to work on this. You'll have to have dialogue with your peers and those who are involved about how they want to be acknowledged and make sure that your acknowledgement is not harmful to people. The final thing I wanted to say around this was around criminal liability and peer researchers. So switching a bit here from sort of just people, non-peer researchers working with or involving peers. This is actually some points about people who are peers, who are researchers. And I think criminal liability for researchers is one that, in my view, is a bit overstated because in practice, there's very few cases of subpoenaed evidence and all of that, research evidence, all of that. But I think that some of the issues around aiding and abetting the commission of a serious offence can be very tricky for peer researchers, people who are really immersed in those communities. Once again, tricky, not impossible to deal with, but be aware of it. I think it goes back to having the policies, strategies and protections in place for people to ensure that if your peer researchers, for example, come to attention of the police because of the work they're doing in their community, they're not then just seen as too risky or too tricky to have involved in the project. I've seen that happen to people and people both lose their job as a peer researcher and they're standing in the community at the same time. So if you're going to go into this stuff, be aware that there are some tricky issues for peer researchers that are not as black and white as maybe they might be for other researchers. So just be aware of that. So to finish, peer involvement in research, tricky or transformational? answer is, as I said, is that it's both. But ultimately, it's far more transformational than tricky because I think, because of the potential benefits to the individuals and communities involved and the potential for peer involvement in research to lead to better research and better research outcomes. And that is the 101 of ethical research practice, which is necessary research done well to the benefit of those who are the focus of the research.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ellie. Thank you so much. And I think just to let everyone know that this is being recorded and so it will be available to people afterwards, and also the slides that have been provided, if that's possible.
Absolutely.
Annie, that would be great. I've got a few questions that have been coming in and I'd like to us to talk a little bit about because I think they're really valid ones. One that goes to the Language Matters guide, Fiona, and I think all of us probably could jump in as we go. But there's an opinion here about it maybe going a bit too far with the dirty, clean needle syringe thing. Working for a needle exchange program as a peer, had numerous discussions with other people who use drugs and they feel the same. Is the language actually stigmatising if it's accurately descriptive rather than using a pejorative or derogatory manner?
That's tricky. No, I think that what we've done with the Language Matters is provide examples. And when you use, we say it so often, I'm a dirty junkie, or they're a dirty junkie, or I've been clean now. I've been clean for this amount of time. What does that entail that when you're clean or not using, you were previously dirty or
unclean,
bad, unclean, contaminated, contagious, whatever you want to say. It's also about asking people what they want to be described as or how they want to be. And I often ask people when they're using that clean, dirty language, what does that mean to you? What do you think is behind that?
Yeah. Particularly given what Chris has said about the internalisation of stigma and discrimination. Just because someone calls them, it says that, uses that themselves, doesn't mean to say that's an empowering thing for that person.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying there goes back to that thing of finding out from someone what they feel comfortable with and not having hard and fast rules about things. Starting the conversation about...
I have a lot of people, older friends in the fellowship, and they use words like addict and clean, and that's fine, and I use those words with them because they're happy with those words and they don't see them as bad words. But, as Annie just said, I kind of still question the underlying reason. For example, I had, a consumer the other day describe their life as being chaotic. They use that word chaotic, but I still wonder, well, where did you get that from? Probably a worker. So it is hard.
It is tricky, but I think, it gets back to that thing of, you were talking right at the beginning, Chris, about people's intentions, some of those small ways of inviting you into a conversation, treating you with respect.
It opens up, a conversation. It does. Because there's barriers there. And, internalised stigma barriers. Like this, for example, they may see a person come in that may seem aggressive, upset, and what's under that, So it's about, being treated with respect.
And I think, and so that there's not, I think with guides like this, it's really about it is absolutely to start that conversation, isn't it? And to really engage people where they're at, what works for them, recognising that for some people they may use certain terms. But I suppose too, it's also thinking about it that it's not just within the context of the work or if you're doing client work, but what are the messages that get out to community members who aren't perhaps as familiar as we might be about different ways of using language? And so really, addressing that as it gets out.
And ultimately, it's great. There's a conversation going on about language. I mean, wherever you land on it, it's a good thing that you're talking about it in the first place, you know.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a good place to start to wrap things up. Is there anything that people wanted to finish with? Is there anything that people wanted to make sure that they left with today? Anything in particular? Because I think what we've really heard is about having the conversation, engaging peers in the conversation.
I think for me, and just realising the time,
I
think that I think it's important that we do more of these to get out to people and focus on these issues for people who use peers, consumers and workers.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So
Next time we might be able to talk about what's the difference between consumers, peers.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Clients.
we'll talk about like this. So we have to finish
Yeah.
up there, but we really appreciate you being here with us. We'll absolutely be doing more of these. It's being recorded, and certainly if there are any other questions that come through, we'll see if we can get back to you at some point.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks.